So this is SRAM's new Red XPLR group set. It's part of an entire gravel-focused group set that has the beefcake-style rear derailleur of a mountain bike, the road-style shifters and handlebars that you'd find on SRAM's new Red group set. However, that's not just the only part of the story. There's also these new beastly 45mm Zipp wheel set here and tires as well. And as much as I'd like to sit here and do a full review on the side of a mountain at 2,060 meters up, me and this wheel set, that wheel in particular back there, have had a time up here. We had a hell of a day yesterday and it was not all good. Just me walking the bike last kilometer or so. I'm gonna let some of that simmer. I'm gonna try to get this bike back the 50 to 90K or so, depending on the route I choose, to the ocean, and then eventually back into the DCR cave where I'll finish up this review. Also, this gives me a chance to clean up the bike when I get back to make it look pretty for you, because apparently you're not supposed to have a dirty bike in review. I don't know, in general, life's more fun when it's dirty.
So let's get straight into all the components. The first thing to understand is that while this is a gravel design group set, it's a bit of a combination of off-the-shelf stuff from SRAM in terms of the components. Looking at the bike, let's start up at the shifters themselves. These are actually the exact same shifters as introduced on SRAM Red on the road side just a few months ago. Straight up identical across the board. This means you're going to get some of those benefits like the increased braking power with just a single finger, which I can attest to. Descending down some of those 15 to 20% grades on what would be considered spicier gravel terrain, I had no problems at all just using one finger to barely tap the brakes and get the braking power I wanted. So good job there. And keeping in mind this is gravel terrain, not mountain bike terrain. And of course the definition of gravel is like wide as the sky, or these new tires for that matter. It's all over the place. In any case, back on the shifters themselves, this also means they include the new bonus buttons on the inside of the bar. So basically the inside of your shifters. These new buttons can be customized to do whatever you want. By default, they just simply act as a secondary shifter, sort of like blips, which this does support, but just actually built into the bars itself, and also sort of like what Shimano's had for years. But more useful than the shifting side of it is assigning it to a bike computer function. You can do that using the SRAM app, which I'll get to in just a second, and then from there on your bike computer you can assign it to any function you want. You can change the data page or set a lap or start and stop, or I mean there's a lot of options. There's way more options on the Hammerhead side than there is on the Garmin side, but there's still a number of options on the Garmin side. And probably the most interesting option is actually on the new Edge 1050, where you can set it to ring the bike bell. And hopefully in theory out in the middle of gravel nowhere you'll have less people to ding at, but I did have some sheep and stuff that I had to get out of the way, so it's handy in those scenarios as well. And yes, once again pointing out the best feature of a brand new $700 bike computer is a bike bell. And hey, just a quick note before we go too much further, if you're finding this video interesting, useful, entertaining, or something like that, just simply whack the like button at the bottom there. It really helped out this video and the channel quite a bit. In any case, moving our way down the bike from the shifters to that front chainring. This is a 1x setup as you'd expect, because obviously, Shimano waiting there for that. That should be no surprise, of course, because SRAM's gone 1x for gravel for quite a while now. Below is the different chainring configurations that you can have there if you want that. But most importantly, from my perspective, is the power meter there. This power meter does use thread mount chainrings. That's really important because it means they are replaceable. Unlike on the SRAM Red road side, where you effectively throw away your power meter when your chain rings die, though theoretically the chain rings last a long time, but point being they're replaceable, which is nice, meaning it's more akin to the mountain bike side than the road side. Most notably though, this is not a left-only power meter like on some of their other cheaper group sets. This is a total power meter mounted on the chain rings, as opposed to left-only power meters in SRAM's configuration that are typically in the bottom bracket. The accuracy claimed here is plus or minus 1.5%, which we'll get to in all sorts of glorious detail in just a second. From there, we slide on back to the crown jewel of this whole group set, which is the rear derailleur and the cassette. The rear derailleur is, of course, the biggest change here and goes to SRAM's transmission-style rear derailleur. That means it's direct mounted via UDH, or the Universal Derailleur Hanger. This means that you must have a UDH-compatible frame set. And while that's very common on mountain bike, it's only just starting to make its way into the gravel market. So that means retrofitting an existing bike might be pretty tough unless you happen to have one of those brand new gravel group sets with a compatible UDH back-end frame sort of situation. For example, this specialized crux I've been riding is just announced today using UDH. There's also other UDH frames out there from the last little while, including the Cervelo Aspero, the latest Canyon Grail, and you're going to see a bunch more bikes announced today. Notably though, this is not compatible with mountain bikes because it's not compatible with suspension, doesn't have a flip chip, and also needs a drop bar configuration as opposed to a flat bar that you typically see on a mountain bike. Now, the whole point of UDH is to somewhat standardize the entire attachment point at the rear there. If you've ever broken a derailleur hanger on any bike, you know the pain and suffering when you're traveling, especially, that you go into a bike shop and of course they don't have that derailleur hanger because there's one for every single flipping frame on this planet, which means they're all different. The point is this is supposed to solve that while also increasing the durability of the actual derailleur itself from the SRAM side and making it less likely that you're going to break things. This also means there's no adjustment screws at all. No high limit screws, no low limit screws, nothing at all. It just simply goes in the spot it's going to go on. So that then brings up the question of durability and damage and stuff like that. And that's kind of the whole point of going to a transmission-like system, as we've seen on SRAM's mountain bike side for a little while now. And in the case of the transmission on the mountain bike side, that's been widely received by both reviewers and, more importantly, regular people as an absolute beast of a tank. And that is definitely the case here as well. I mean, this thing is a complete beefcake compared to any other derailleur that you've had on a gravel bike or a road bike. In my case, I've been throwing quite a bit at it up in the mountains and stuff like that. I mean, that's not the piece that broke during my journey. We'll get to that in just a second. So then you may be wondering, what's the difference between SRAM's existing transmission rear derailleur found on mountain bikes and the new Red XPLR rear derailleur? And SRAM says they are very, very similar. They said, though, that XPLR prioritizes, quote, shift speed and responsiveness over shifting under load, which is what transmission on the mountain bike side. This means that the mountain bike transmission will perform better under shifting under really high load, whereas the XPLR is focused on the shift speed and responsiveness. To be clear though, I had no problem shifting under load. It's not like you can't shift under load or anything like that. It's just simply that one is optimized for one thing and one is optimized for a different thing. They're both very similar in the grand scheme of things. The other thing you're gonna notice at the back there is that 13-speed cassette. Yes, we're up to 13 speeds now, is the new standard, if you will. Now, it's still using the same XDR driver body, and that's really important for a lot of reasons, mainly if you want to put it on a trainer, it's all the same driver body. It also uses a virtually identical chain to 12-speed on the roadside. SRAM says that while the two chains are identical and physically identically looking, there's actually differences in the finishes between the road and the mountain bike chain for each application. Point being, you can use one or the other in a pinch and it's going to be totally fine. But for the most optimal setup long term, you're going to want to use the right chain for the job, if you will. Now, from a component standpoint, just to kind of step back for a quick second here, here's the pieces that are exactly the same as SRAM Red 12-speed, meaning they are the exact components from SRAM Red 12-speed road. They include the controls, all the shifters and levers, including the bonus button. They include the calipers. They include the chain, again with the minor finishing notes as noted above, and they include the XDR driver body of basically underneath that cassette there. Now, I will throw some weights and all sorts of boring stat stuff down at the bottom there. Also, I'll even overlay some boring price stuff as well right now. But pricing stuff on group sets is always kind of weird because realistically, most people buy group sets, new group sets anyways, with bikes, since it's usually a much better deal. Now, before we talk about like the electronic integration bits here, let's just quickly talk about road feel. From a shift responsiveness standpoint, it was crispy and fast, which as you would expect. I noted I had no issues at all shifting under load. None of that stuff was a problem. It was great. From an ergonomic standpoint, it's the same, again, like whole shifter setup as on SRAM Red. So I've been riding that this past spring for a number of months. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the app piece before we get to the things that broke on me. Okay, so this is the SRAM Access app. This allows you to go ahead and add bikes into it, multiple bikes if you want to, add components, electronic components into that bike, and then tweak those components from the app itself. You can see here I added a new bike, the Specialized Crux, and I added those components into the bike by just simply pressing the buttons on the components to do that pairing process. There is a process to manually ensure that you are in control of the bike so you're not like tweaking someone else's components just as they rode by or whatever. You can see the four main components here. I've got the rear derailleur, my front left shifter, my front right shifter, and then the power meter. If I were to tap on one of these components, you can see obviously before that, the battery is good there. I can tap on it, I can check firmware. In this case, the RD is fully updated on firmware. XPLR. And then the power meter down here, you can do the same thing. But power meter gives you a couple more options before we talk about the drivetrain configuration options. At the top up there, I got power meter settings and info. This is all stuff from like the old Quark days, but it's still here because some people still use it. But you can change like cadence direction and torque direction. You can go into the old school SRM power control mode if you wanted to pair it up to an SRM head unit. And of course, you can adjust the slope down at the bottom there. In the back of the main page there, you can also set the 0 right from the app itself. The same thing that you're effectively doing for most of your bike computers. When you hit calibrate, it's really just doing a 0 offset. Now, backing out into the drivetrain controls itself, the configurations, up at the very, very top, you have configure controls. This is where you can configure what every single one of those buttons does on your shifters. So you can see the left button right there, by default will downshift, but you could upshift if you wanted to, that's fine. The bonus button I've set to be an amp plus control. So you tap the bonus button there, and then down below you expand that out, and you go into the function set number 1 for a short press. But you can see there's like 8 different ways you can do it. And so all different functions that you can configure. From there on the bike computer, after I've paired those shifters, the second this happens, it goes, hey, there's a function that's been set here. Do you want to assign it a new function on the edge unit? And you can assign it whatever function you want. In my case, I assign it the bike bell, but I could assign it to change a data page or do whatever I want there. As I mentioned earlier on, lots more options on the Hammerhead side than on the Garmin side, but all the core ones you want are on the Garmin side there. And this is also totally supported on Wahoo as well for essentially all those same functions. If we go back here, you see again the same thing on the right controller, and then combination buttons as well. Right now they're unassigned, but you can have it so that, you know, doing the double tap on the shifters does something. I could open that up and assign it to some other action. There's really not that many actions you can do here in that particular scenario because it's a one by up front. Going on back here to drivetrain settings, I can do micro adjustment settings right there, so I can do it directly from the app itself if something's just out of alignment. And that is a sum total of the configuration options from the app. One thing that's cool though is if you do hook up your Garmin or Hammerhead to SRAM Access from a platform standpoint, you basically just link the back end like you would link Strava, then you'll get battery notifications automatically. So it records that to the files, and then you'll get a push notification as well as an email when the battery on your Access system is low, which is pretty handy. Otherwise, you'll just see basically your completed activities in that list right there. In terms of the battery is the exact same as on SRAM Access and ETAP before. It's the same battery forever. Like, serious kudos to SRAM there for not dorking with that battery. In terms of like just sticking with a tiny little battery that's there forever, good job. However, the charger that's included in the box is still a micro USB charger. Come on, SRAM, give me USB-C. There's no reason for that. You have your 4-pack charger that can charge up to 4 different batteries at once, which is USB-C. But I suppose the good news is that I can go on Amazon and buy both a single, double, and a quad USB-C charger that are knockoffs that are great, and they're like 10 or 15 bucks, which is what I've done. I've just got a dual one with me, and then I keep an extra battery or 2 in my kind of bag there, so I always have something just in case it goes wrong. Okay, so let's talk power meter accuracy before we get into the things that broke. First up, I went ahead and I just got things tested real quick on an indoor trainer. Like, that's my first step to validating power meter accuracy. In this case, because I didn't have a spare 13-speed cassette, I put it on a 12-speed cassette. That's not optimal from like a chain standpoint and the drivetrain losses. We're going to see that in just a second here. But it gave me like a quick validation that things are in the ballpark before I spend a bunch of time somewhere else. As you can see, it's basically spot on with the Favero Asioma MX2 Pros. They're brand new, mountain bike and gravel power meter that's been very well reviewed across the board by myself and others as being super accurate. It's within like 1 to 2 watts of that on the trainer, which is really, really good. In this case, on the Tax Neo 3M, which is also a hyper accurate trainer, the Neo 3M is reading about 5 to 7 watts lower, but that makes complete and total sense. That's because I have a non-optimized chain line setup right now, with it being a 12-speed road on a 13-speed bike and so on. And also, it's probably not super clean, my drivetrain, because I'm lazy like that. But point being, that makes sense with also drivetrain losses accounted for it as well. So good job there to start off with. From there, I did a quick loop around the forest to make sure like Everything was good outside as well. You can see that here with the MX2s, again, spot on, like a couple watts away from each other. Just really nice to see good power meters from companies that understand how to make power meters and been doing it for a long time. In any event, from there it was out into the real world. So I had to get up into the mountains to start my gravel adventure. So here's the first ride I did, starting off just before sunset and then riding up into the mountains. And that's really notable because I'm basically decreasing temperature across this entire time frame of 2.5 hours of going up, roughly about 1,000 meters of elevation gain. So it's cool to see if there's any temperature shift issues in that data set from any of these units. And as you can see here on these charts, it's like spot on across the board, whether it be surges or steady state, they're virtually identical with a max spread of like 2 to 3 watts. I mean, this is really, really, really impressive. Whether it's looking at the mean max side of it or looking at the cadence side of it, like everything is good despite this temperature shift from just before sunset to darkness by the time I got up there to the village. Now, the next day, an 8.5-hour day on the bike. The initial climb, I started off on road. That looks great. And then from there, I transitioned to gravel and kept on climbing for many, many hours. And that looks great as well. In fact, I can keep skipping around on this chart until the bike broke. And everything looks great at that point in time. Going beyond the bike breaking and me figuring out how to fix it, the next day, another 7.5 hours on the bike, no problems at all, descending back out of the mountains. And again, kind of the inverse from a temperature standpoint, going from cooler in the morning to hot at the beaches by the time I got back down to the ocean again, and no problems there at all. And then finally, one more ride just for funsies. You can see here, it's essentially spot on. No issues there at all on this ride. That's what you get when you have a company that knows how to make a power meter. So last but not least, let's get to that wheel set. It's a new wheel set, as you can see right here, a mind-boggling 45mm wheel set from Zipp, which SRAM owns, of course. And then with that, there's also new tires via partnership with Goodyear. And so basically, SRAM and Goodyear have partnered to co-brand this as an Explorer tire. And so theoretically, this is like the peak of all peaks from a gravel goodness, gravel performance, gravel racing group set. The idea here with these wider tires is that you can basically get dramatically lower tire pressures, kind of like we see on the mountain bike side. But in this case, SRAM says they're also increasing puncture resistance and actually getting faster from a rolling resistance standpoint as well. SRAM had some media calls and they walked through all their testing they did. And as usual with media calls, there's lots of like marketing, blah, blah, blah. But there was some cool like tech goodness in here. First off, they tested this wheel set on a treadmill that had almost like small little board plank things on there to simulate gravel, but they were testing it from a rolling resistance standpoint, which was like, that's kind of neat. And then they did the same test outside on a relatively controlled set of gravel, but they used an aero sensor to go ahead and control for any environmental differences. So if the wind changes and stuff like that, they can determine whether or not it was aerodynamics that was impacting roller resistance or something else. I thought that was interesting. The result of which is tire pressures which are way, way, way lower than you would think. Just for context here, they have like an updated little app that allows you to put in your specs and stuff like that, and then it spits out your tire pressure. For my setup, including the bike, all the crap I had on it, myself as a body, water and stuff like that, all in it was basically 90 kilos. And I was running, according to their little calculator, at an ideal tire pressure of 27 to 28 PSI, depending on which wheel you're looking at, which is way super impressive. But if I was eating like less Haribo, we're talking tire pressures down in the 23 to 24 PSI as the fastest possible setup. These are like the ideal performance setups according to SRAM. And in my case, I installed a pair of the SRAM or Quark Tire Wiz, basically air pressure sensors on there, so I can monitor this the entire time. And also, super importantly, know exactly which tire pressures I was running when shit went wrong. And that's what happened. So I was 5 to 6 hours into the second day of the ride. I had like passed the summit for the day, and I had 8 to 10 kilometers of relatively fun and chill kind of rolling gravel left up in the mountains to make it time for dinner. This was like the golden hour of riding. Like this is the time where you're like, yep, we got this. The day is almost done. It's perfect temps, perfect roads and stuff like that. And then this happened. Astoundingly, caught on camera right here. Yep, that's my tire getting punctured. Not just once, double puncture on relatively chill roads. I'll let you watch it again, just for funsies. So obviously I stopped because you have to kind of stop at that point in time, and I assessed the damage. And I can immediately see there was 2 punctures to the side, so roughly kind of like a pinch flat. No problem, I've got all the bacon strips in the world, so I stuffed some bacon strips in there and made it about like 10 meters, and The bacon strips weren't holding. It just, the punctures were, one of them was just simply too big. The other one wasn't too bad, but one was too big. So I'm like, well, that sucks. So I fitzed with it for a little while, and then I was going to put a spare tube in it. But when I was packing the spare tube that I grabbed, I did not account for this basically loaner wheel set being a much deeper rim. So my spare tube didn't fit. So now I'm in deep wilderness with no cell phone coverage, with no tube, and not in a good spot. Yeah, that was dumb of me to grab the wrong tube. But like, I would have thought this wheel set's like designed as the pinnacle of all wheel sets with the pinnacle of all tires, and on relatively chill ground, it shouldn't have flatted. So I'm gonna save you 3 hours of walking, trying to fix it back and forth. Literally, I would fix it. It would go like 500 meters. It would die again. Eventually, some motorcyclists that were touring up in the area, they're allowed on certain days on the road, and thankfully this was one of those days, came along, and they had some motorcycle bacon strip, basically plugs that went in there. That actually held for maybe like 800 meters or a kilometer, not that long before it too was spit out. Just the hole was too big. So I just rode it like half flat, half not flat, and eventually 3 hours later, got to the refuge through a lot of walking and stuff like that. And obviously bad on me for not having a spare tube. At the refuge that night, a bunch of other guys and I, after dinner, tried to patch it with a patch kit. But because of the way the two holes are so close, it just wasn't holding that well. We tried overnight letting it harden and everything like that. And ultimately, I was still losing about 1 PSI per minute, which isn't good enough to get me 90 kilometers back to the ocean or down pretty rough terrain. But thankfully, in the back of this refuge, and a stack of like books, there were some tubes, and one of those tubes, out of the 9 tubes there was actually the right length to make it work in this particular setup. So got the tube in there, and off I went back home. No problems descending on actually much rougher terrain, descending back down again with that tube in place, and got back down to the ocean. However, when I got down there 90K later, I noticed a secondary tear in the side of the tire wall, which isn't great. That was not the side that was hit. It's just a weird tear there. So I took all this stuff, all this footage, I sent it back to SRAM, and I was like, what's your thoughts? And they came back and they said, they looked at the video closely and they agreed with me. Like, that tire should not have punctured on that road in that conditions. That's a pretty chill scenario, and that's not ideal. In any case, they're digging into it with Goodyear. They're gonna get the tire back. They're trying to figure out what went wrong there, whether it's manufacturing or something else. But they agree that this tire shouldn't have flatted on those conditions. And obviously, there's not really much more I can say there. I'm not gonna like beat that dead horse too much. It is what it is, which is unfortunate given the price of the wheel set. But it was great up until that point. And to its credit, it descended just fine across all sorts of terrain that was definitely more on the spicier gravel side than not. Okay, so where are we overall? Well, from a group set standpoint, I'm pretty darn happy with this. If I was to go out and buy a new bike and put a group set on it, I would probably put this on there, just because the durability side of it, not having to worry about, especially during travel, from a derailleur standpoint, getting dorked up without taking it off and stuff like that, which this is handy in that respect. Power meter accuracy is spot on. I like, of course, the bonus button for the bike bell and other things, but mostly just the bike bell. And so all that stuff is good. Like, I'm pretty happy across the board. The wheel set, I was super happy up until it died. But if they can figure that out, and keep in mind, it's not the wheel itself per se, it's that tire, though the whole point is that tire is designed for that wheel, and they're designed as a team, and all that goodness. So we'll have to see what happens there. I'll drop a comment and pin it down below once SRAM and Goodyear kind of get that tire back and figure out what went wrong there. Maybe the answer is simply just like I had the one in a lot of thousands bad luck sort of flat that can still happen in cycling. It's like that's just life, right? But in any case, overall, hopefully you found this video interesting or useful or something like that. I've also got a full written review linked down below if you want even more of the tech spec details that are just really boring to talk about in a video. With that, don't forget to whack the like button or subscribe for plenty more sports technology goodness. Have a good one.